The arena went silent. It's a strange kind of quiet, the one that holds the breath of 20,000 people. It isn't empty. It's full. Full of anticipation. Cody Rhodes stood in the center of the ring, the lights catching the intricate details of his suit. Everyone leaned in, expecting the usual fire, the next chapter in his quest to finish the story. We've seen it 100 times. A superstar, a microphone, and a familiar promise. But something was different tonight. You could feel it in the air. A subtle shift in barometric pressure that only comes when the script is about to be ignored. He let the silence hang there, letting it settle over the crowd like a heavy blanket. He wasn't rushing. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud or aggressive. It was measured, thoughtful, almost confessional. He talked about his journey, the path back to the top, but then he veered off course. He said the biggest threat wasn't always the one sitting on the throne. Sometimes, he said, it's the one standing beside it, poisoned by ambition. He named Drew McIntyre, and a predictable wave of boos followed. But that wasn't the bombshell. The real strike came next. Cody looked directly into the camera, his eyes finding a lens that felt like it was miles away, backstage. And he said that Drew was just a symptom. The real disease, the real darkness he had to worry about, was the architect of that bitterness. He was talking about the mentor. He was talking about Randy Orton. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer anticipation. It was pure, unadulterated confusion. The crowd didn't know how to react. They were programmed for a hero versus villain narrative, and Cody had just tangled the wires completely. Backstage, the world stopped. Monitors were stared at. Headsets crackled with questions nobody had the answers to. Was this planned? Did Orton know? I was standing near the gorilla position, and I saw Drew McIntyre's face on a nearby screen. His reaction wasn't simple anger. It was a complex cocktail of fury, validation, and a flicker of surprise. Cody had just acknowledged his crusade, but he'd also undermined it, painting him as a puppet. But my eyes, like everyone else's, went to the other monitor, the one showing a live feed of Randy Orton's private locker room. He was lacing his boots, half listening. When Cody said his name, he didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply stopped moving. His hands rested on the laces, perfectly still. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't the explosive anger you'd expect. It was far more terrifying. It was the stillness of a predator that had just heard a twig snap in the darkness, a sound that does not belong. The game had just changed, and Randy Orton was the only one who truly understood the new rules. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the pressure of being the Viper. For 20 years, Randy Orton hasn't just played a character. He has been a living embodiment of a terrifying idea. The apex predator. The legend killer. These aren't just nicknames. They're a cage. A man has to carry the weight of that expectation into every arena, every match, every single day. There's a coldness required, a detachment that keeps everyone at arm's length. He's a mentor to many, but a friend to few. That's the price of being at the top of the food chain. In Drew McIntyre, Orton saw a reflection, but it was a distorted one from a funhouse mirror. He saw the same ambition, the same hunger that drove him in his youth, but Drew's ambition was wrapped in a righteous indignation, a bitterness that Orton himself had learned to temper and weaponize with surgical precision. Drew wore his anger like a coat. Orton kept his hidden like a blade. He was guiding the younger man. Yes, but it was the guidance of a master teaching an apprentice how to harness the dart. He wasn't teaching him to be a hero. He was teaching him how to be a killer. Cody's words hadn't just insulted him. They had questioned his very nature, suggesting the monster he had so carefully controlled for 2 decades was slipping its leash. The backstage area became a hive of controlled chaos. Producers were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Writers were flipping through scripts, confirming what everyone already knew. This was not in the show, these was real. The immediate concern was Drew. We expected him to explode, to storm through the curtain and confront Cody right then and there. And he was angry. He could see it. He paced back and forth, his jaw clenched, muttering to himself. He saw Cody's words as a gift, a perfect piece of fuel for his fire. He believed this public call-out, elevated his mission. He was so consumed with his own narrative that he completely missed the more dangerous development. While Drew was a storm, all thunder and lightning, Orton was the calm in its eye. He had finally looked up at the monitor. He wasn't watching Cody anymore. His gaze was fixed on Drew's pacing figure. There was no anger on his face. There was something else, a quiet, clinical observation. It was the look of a craftsman inspecting a tool that had just revealed a fatal flaw. He saw Drew's ego, his self-absorption, and in that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. Drew thought they were partners in a war against Cody Rhodes. Orton now saw a liability, a loose end, and the Viper's only ever done one thing with loose ends. It didn't take long. Orton found Drew in the narrow hallway that leads from the locker rooms to the main corridor. It's a place where cameras don't usually linger, but a lone cameraman, sensing something was about to happen, kept his distance and just kept rolling. This wasn't a segment. There was no dramatic lighting, no perfectly framed shot. It was raw. Orton didn't march up to Drew. He simply appeared, blocking his path. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence do the work for him. Drew, still riding the adrenaline from Cody's promo, was ready for a strategy session. He was ready to plan their attack. But Orton wasn't there to plan. His voice, when it came, was unnervingly soft. He didn't mention Cody. He didn't mention the promo. He just looked at Drew, his eyes holding an intensity that the camera could barely capture. And he said, "Never let another man tell your story for you." It was a simple line, but it was laced with a dozen meanings. It was a bise. It was a warning, and most of all, it was a test. Drew was so focused on the target in front of him, Cody, that he failed to realize the man standing beside him was judging him, weighing his worthiness, and deciding his fate based on his next move. Drew misread the entire exchange. In his mind, Orton's warning was a sign of solidarity. He saw it as a veteran rallying his soldier, a call to arms. A confident, almost arrogant smirk crossed his face. "Don't worry about me, Randy," Drew said, clapping a hand on Orton's shoulder. "He just gave us the ammunition we need. We'll handle Cody together." It was the wrong thing to say. The hand on the shoulder was the wrong thing to do. In that instant, I saw it. Anyone who's been around Randy long enough saw it. The flicker, it was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift behind his eyes. The mentor, the strategic partner, the alite, all evaporated. What was left was something ancient and cold. The casual touch, the confident we. It was a profound miscalculation. It showed Orton that Drew saw him not as the apex predator, but as a supporting character in his own melodrama. The disrespect was unintentional, born of ego, but it was disrespect nonetheless. The disappointment on Orton's face was quickly replaced by a chilling clarity. He took a half step back, the friendly hand falling from his shoulder. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away, leaving Drew standing there, utterly oblivious. The test was over, and Drew had failed. The final straw came an hour later. It wasn't a big moment. It wasn't even in front of the crowd. It was in the cramped, electric-filled space, just behind the curtain known as the gorilla position. Drew was preparing for his own match, fired up and ready to send a message to Cody. Orton was there, watching the monitor, seemingly calm. As Drew was about to walk through the curtain, he turned to Orton one last time. He was buzzing, a ball of kinetic energy. He looked at Orton and said, with a dismissive wave of his hand, "Watch this. I'll do in 5 minutes what you've been trying to do for 20 years. Make them feel something real." He meant it as a boast, a declaration of his own passionate crusade compared to what he saw as Orton's cold, methodical style. But the words hung in the air, thick and heavy with implication. He hadn't just insulted Orton's methods. He had insulted his entire legacy. He had dismissed 20 years of dominance, of survival, of bloodshed, as emotionally hollow. For a man like Orton, whose entire career has been a masterclass in psychological warfare and controlled emotion, it was the ultimate blasphemy. We all saw his head turn slowly. The look in his eyes was no longer cold or clinical. It was hot. It was pure, unfiltered rage. The performance was over. There was no RKO. An RKO is for the show. This was for him. In a blur of motion that was shockingly fast for a man his size, Orton crossed the few feet between them. He grabbed the front of Drew's gear, slamming him backward against a rack of road cases with a sickening thud that echoed louder than the roar of the crowd outside. Equipment rattled and fell. Everyone froze. The producers, the agents, the other wrestlers waiting for their cues, they all stopped dead. Orton's face was inches from Drew's, his knuckles white where he gripped the fabric. The whisper was gone. In its place was a low, venomous growl that cut through the noise. "Real," he hissed, the word dripping with 2 decades of fury. "You know nothing about what's real." His voice was shaking, not weak fear, but with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate through the floor. He wasn't the Viper anymore. It wasn't a WWE superstar. He was Randy Orton, the man stripped bare of his persona, defending the very foundation of his life's work. In that moment, everyone watching realized they were seeing something they were never meant to see. They were seeing the truth behind the character, the raw nerve that had finally been exposed, and it was terrifying. It took 3 road agents and a security guard to pull Orton off of him. There was no struggle, really. Once they made contact, Orton simply let go, as if a switch had been flipped and the power was cut. He straightened his shirt, his breathing heavy but controlled, and without a single look back at the shocked and utterly bewildered Drew McIntyre, he turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing into the labyrinth of the arena's backstage. Drew was left standing there, leaning against the cases, his chest heaving. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He had been playing checkers, and he had just tried to make a move on a grandmaster's chessboard. He finally understood the warning from earlier. He had crossed a line, a sacred boundary he never even knew existed. The story of that confrontation spread through the locker room like wildfire. It became one of those "were you there when" moments. The official narrative would be spun later, of course. It would be folded into the on-screen storyline, presented as another chapter in their heated rivalry. The shove, the words. It would all be repackaged for public consumption. But for those of us who saw it, we knew the truth. It wasn't an angle. It was an eruption. It was the result of 20 years of pressure finding a hairline fracture and bursting through. Fame in this business is a strange thing. It demands you build a persona, a character so strong it can withstand the roar of the crowd and the glare of the lights. You build walls around yourself to protect the person underneath. For Randy Orton, those walls were higher and thicker than anyone else's. He had to be the Viper, the cold, calculating predator. Every second he was in that building. What Cody's promo did was place a small, almost insignificant charge at the base of that wall. But it was Drew's careless, ego-driven words that lit the fuse. What we saw in that hallway wasn't a betrayal or the beginning of a feud. It was a glimpse of the man who has to live inside the legend. It was a reminder of the immense, soul-crushing weight that these performers carry every single night. The world saw the aftermath, the story WWE wanted them to see. But the few who were there saw the crack form and splinter in real time. It was a brief, violent, and honest moment that would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. It was a reminder that even legends are human, and sometimes the mask cracks.